Hey guys, it's Filter SC here, and I'm back for my Terran episode number 11 for Heart of the Swarm. And this time we're going to be taking a look at standard builds, and why you should be learning them, how they're really going to help your play, and yeah, let's jump on into it. So the first thing is, what is the definition of a standard build? When I talk about a standard build, typically I mean something that has a very long-term focus to it. And usually the build is something that will take a long time to master and really kind of push your ability to play the game. If a build is challenging to pull off correctly and has very difficult timings that you kind of have to hit to keep yourself safe against certain things, that's when you know it's a good solid standard build. And quite typically a standard build will have various branching and deviations that you can take yourself that'll help keep you safe against things like, you know, if your opponent goes for a 2-base Colossus and you're doing a very typical standard Terran build where you're getting fast upgrades and you're looking to kind of hit a timing when you get your first few medevacs out. When your opponent has those 2 or 3 very fast Colossus, what you're going to want to do is delay them while you get your Vikings up. And typically their build is designed to kill you with those 2 Colossus. If they don't do that and you're able to shoot them out of the sky with good solid reactionary play, they're not going to have upgrades and stuff like that behind it, and you can just go train roll them over and win the game from there. So that's kind of what a standard build is. It just has a whole bunch of different plans in place for various situations that can pop up, while having kind of an overarching idea and strategy behind the build, as well it's very difficult to master. So as I mentioned before, typically a very standard build has either a mid-game or a late-game plan. Examples of a late-game plan standard build would be the most obvious ones from Wings of Liberty, which is when Zergs would go for really heavy Infestor Broodlord and try to win the game in like the 15, 20, 25 minute mark and really push it hard to the late game. Examples of like really mid-game focused stuff is a lot of what Terran does when they use bioplay. Bioplay is designed to keep the game on mid-game level tech and not let the Zerg kind of get up to Ultralisks and, you know, constantly expand, but really focus on, you know, heavy unit production, heavy upgrades for those mid-game units, and constant pushing and constant fighting, right? The build is not designed to max out with a standard quote-unquote build, get to 200 supply, and then just like kind of roll over and A-move your opponent. A lot of standard builds are designed around the mid-game, with a focus on a lot of attacks, and getting up extra bases behind it, that kind of stuff. An example of kind of standard mech play would be, you know, you do a lot of drops in the mid-game to harass, and you eventually want to get up this kind of unstoppable position where you get a lot of siege tanks, you get a lot of Hellbats, that kind of stuff, right? And that's very much based around the late game style of play when you talk mech. But the standard bio play is kind of based around the mid game. So there's 2 different kinds of real standard play, which are mid and late game based armies. That being said, when you are dealing with a standard build, there's no real situation that will come up that will say, well, that was a loss because my opponent did X. There's almost always situations where you can kind of pull yourself out or make adjustments to your unit composition, what upgrades you're making, if you're being aggressive, if you're trying to drop, that kind of stuff. It all kind of fits into a standard build being really, really good to play with. Now, quite typically, what makes a standard build really, really good is it allows for reactionary play. So a really good example is if you're playing against a Zerg opponent and you're on mid-game, so they're on Ling, Bane, Muta, and you're on your standard Biomine, right? And you're constantly pressuring your opponent's 4th base, trying to kill it off. You're constantly pressuring their 3rd base. There's a lot of action, a lot of fighting in the middle of the map. Eventually you just overwhelm them and you win the game, right? That's your standard game. That's your standard build going exactly to plan, playing out exactly how you wanted it. Where your opponent goes for his mid-game tech and you essentially just outproduce him and beat him because you're a better player. That's the idea behind a standard build. If you're a better player, you're going to win the game, right? Now, what I mean by reactionary play being allowed in a standard build, let's say your opponent chooses to skip Mutalisks, and you notice this. He's basically just on Ling Bane, and he doesn't have a lot, and it's a really good drop map, right? So your opponent skip Mutalisks, you scan him out, he's already going for his hive tech really, really fast, right? And in that example, your opponent doesn't have any drop defense. So rather than constantly trying to pressure him and push him because he is skipping the Mutalisks, he's going to have a lot more Banelings, that kind of stuff. What you want to do is just drop your opponent a lot. When you're doing that, you're abusing the fact that he chose to skip the Mutalisks, right? So you're a little bit more focused on defending, and you're a lot more focused on drop play. And it's just a slight reaction to what your opponent is trying to do, and what he's trying to accomplish, that allows your standard build to essentially come out on top, right? It's very much based around the idea that I'm a better player than my opponent. I'm not necessarily a better macro player. I'm not going to get to 200 faster, all that stuff, but I have a better game plan, and my build and the way I'm playing overall is going to allow me to beat this player simply because my mechanics are better than him. Right? That's the idea behind the standard play. Okay, so the next thing to talk about with standard play is the standard builds typically take a very long time to master. And the reason for this is there's so many different layers to them. There's all sorts of different things you can do. There's all kinds of different ways to play it. There's all sorts of different branching paths, different things you have to do when you react to something your opponent's doing. A lot of people ask me, like, what do I do against this situation? Well, it really depends on what build you're doing. And if you're mapping out a standard build, that's when you're going to learn. So sometimes, every now and then, you'll go up and maybe you're just starting a standard build, and you're going to lose, like, 5 or 10 games in a row, and then that build's going to click, and you're going to start winning those games in those situations more and more often, right? A really good example is when I'm using my standard TVZ build, whenever there's kind of like a mid-game type situation that comes up and the game stays on mid-game a lot, I find it very, very easy to win. I have like no trouble with like Roach Hydra, compositions like that. I have very little trouble with like, Ling, Baneling, Muta. Mutas used to be a big weakness of mine. Now I don't fear them at all in TVZ. But what can catch me is not dropping enough when my opponent tries to just quickly tech to Ultralisk, right? That'll catch me with my pants down a lot, and the Ultras will just essentially roll me over because I haven't done the damage I need to do to stop the Ultras from coming out in the first place. So the idea with really safe, good, strong standard play is that it takes a long time to master, but it's very rewarding to do so, and there's always a binary reason why you lost. Then when you look at the replay, it's very easy to spot, right? So every single TVZ I've lost, I've been able to go, okay, well, these are the mistakes I made that cost me the game. Very simple, very straightforward. When you're doing like a Band-Aid build or a cheese, it's like, okay, my opponent reacted really well to this. It didn't do what it was supposed to do. I lost the game. Right? My opponent outplayed me. When you're doing a standard play, the only person that's outplaying you is yourself, right? That's the only reason you ever lose if you play standard. Or what a more standard build is, right? Like, there's all sorts of different reactions and things you can do to take advantage of different situations your opponent does. So it's almost always your fault when you lose when you're playing a standard build. That's what makes them really, really good. That's what makes them fun to use, and that's why they take a long time to master. And that's why a lot of times I will use a Band-Aid build for, two of my other matchups, because you really have to focus a lot on one particular matchup to kind of get that mastery, to really feel comfortable in taking on any style when you're playing against that, and then you can go and look at your TVT. Then you can go look at your TVP. And keep in mind, this is something I'm doing as more of a mid-master player, right? This is the time that I'm like, okay, now I need to step back and really take a long look at my play and start working on standard builds for each matchup, and I'm only working on them one at a time, so keep that in mind. The better you get, the more effective this is gonna end up being, right? Now, the other thing you have to keep in mind with what I would consider a standard build is a lot of times there's a very anti-meta weakness that will show up in a standard build that is really difficult to control. This doesn't happen too much for Terran because you can do things like bunkers, you can turtle a little bit better, and then wrap back around to your standard play. But if you're a Protoss player or you're a Zerg player, a lot of times your builds are just going to have things that are going to kill you that are against the meta. So a really good example of this is in TVP right now, if you were to do, say, a 3 barracks, stim timing, where you don't even expand, you just get a lot of units off 3 barracks and you get stim, that's actually going to kill a lot of Protoss players off. Now, the reason that build is not in the meta and it's not very popular is because of things like Dark Templar. Actually, you just hard counter that build because you really only have the one command center to scan, and you need to be using that to drop mules, right? And Protoss players got better with their force fields. That being said, you could probably get like a 60 or 70% win rate with that build at Masters level play, right? Now, the disadvantage to that is you're always just going to lose to Dark Templar when you do that type of build, right? And as a Protoss player, if you're playing and you lose to somebody who does that particular timing to you and you're not going for Dark Templar, and you didn't scout it out in time, it's unfortunate. A lot of times, even if you do see it coming, there's not a lot of stuff you can do to stop it. So it's one of those things that's just like, well, he can keep doing that build, but everybody's already figured out like where that build is good and where its major weakness is, right? So it's really important to understand that sometimes when you're doing standard play, there's going to be something that's completely against the current meta, that might kill you off or might give you a really hard time, and you don't necessarily need to worry about those things. Things like 4-gates you do, because 4-gate is very much still something viable in the meta. It's just very different and all in right now. Alright, so the next thing I want to talk about is what I call the flash effect. Now, what is the flash effect? Well, anybody that's a fan of Flash and has seen a lot of his games recently knows that he's been struggling a lot in TVZ. This is despite being, one of the best TVZ players in the world, and despite having probably the best TVZ build out there. And the reason for this is when Flash goes and plays an opponent in the Pro League, that opponent knows he's playing Flash in advance, they know the map and all that stuff, and what happens is because Flash is the better player, he's not playing reactive. He has to try to execute his build to the absolute best of his ability and win the game. Now what his opponent's doing is his opponent is dissecting the way Flash plays and trying to really take advantage of any kind of small hole he can find through, hours and hours of study and working with his coach to try to perfect a technique that'll be very good against Flash. Now what people have started doing to him is just going for a ton of banelings in the mid game and trying to win the game, on baneling and zergling and not really even going to muta, not trying to get to lair or not trying to get to hive. They're getting to lair to get speed banelings, but they're trying to hit kind of an anti-timing for Flash's build. Now the disadvantage to this is, while this might work against Flash when you're dealing with professional level players that are playing at a Pro League standard, what's going to happen is if you try to emulate what those Zergs are doing, you're going to lose to so many different things that Terran can do, and Terran can abuse you with, that are not basically trying to play exactly like how Flash plays, right? So it's very much, you have to be careful when you're trying to steal a build or rip off a player's playstyle. You have to remember that the build that Flash does and the way Flash plays is still extremely good, really well thought out, and absolute top level. And when you're talking about yourself playing on ladder, his build has all the reactionary tools to deal with anything kind of standard that the Zerg might throw at him. That being said, if you are trying to execute that build, and the Zerg does stuff that people have been doing against Flash in the Pro League, you're going to struggle a little bit to defend it. But the thing to keep in mind is if those Zergs are doing that against a Terran that's going for Marine Tank, or any of the older styles, or something that just directly counters getting a lot of banelings and that kind of stuff, those Zergs are just not going to win very many games. So it's not a safe, stable way for the Zergs to play, whereas for you, using that Flash build, it's a very safe way for you to play. So you have to understand, there is the Flash effect. When you go look at his games and you go, oh man, I've just watched this guy go 0-5 or 0-6 in his last 6 Pro League TVZs. His build's not very good. He's not a good TVZ player. No, that's not true. You have to remember the situation that he's in when he's dealing with the Pro League stuff. So it's really important that you understand the Flash effect. Now, that being said, I'm going to throw a quick little warning out there for you. Sometimes the metagame does change because certain builds become too strong, so players just kind of blindly counter those out, and that's what effectively changes the metagame, right? So you want to be a little bit careful, because in 6 months, the build that Flash is doing right now might end up not being very good because the metagame changes, and maybe we have to go into Marauder Tank. Maybe that's the new metagame because Zergs don't get mutalists at all, which will never happen, but you have to keep in mind things do change in the metagame. So just a little bit of a warning that sometimes things change. Now the next question people are going to ask is, where can I find really good safe standard builds? And the simple answer is, when you go look at Team Liquid strategy, so not Team Liquid Wiki, because a lot of those builds are out of date, but Team Liquid strategy is where you're going to find some of the most up-to-date stuff. The thing to keep in mind is a lot of those are cutting edge, really cool builds. A good example is the Tails DT drop. Is an absolute cutting edge, fantastic build, but it definitely has some really strong weaknesses and flaws that are inherent within the build that can sometimes be very difficult to overcome, right? So what you want to do is when you're looking for builds that are not band-aids, they're just safe, solid, standard builds, you want to watch somebody play that particular matchup 10 or 15 games, if at all possible. You want to try to find replays of exactly how they're executing it, and you want to try to kind of find something they do in every game that's very similar. So a good example is when I was trying to rip off the Flash build, right? What he was doing is he was getting 6 Hellions, then he was getting some Widow Mines to try to position those aggressively, and from there he was getting his 2 Engineering Bays and Stim and medevacs and all that, and a lot of barracks behind it. The other kind of key thing he was doing is he was taking his third very, very quickly. If the Zerg player was trying to play macro game at all, Flash was trying to take his third at like 8 minutes or 8:30, and what he ended up doing is he ended up pushing out just before Mutalisk would come on the field at about 11:30 with 140 food, right? So that's how I've dissected Flash's build, right? So when I go to try to emulate that in my own game, I'm looking to go CC first into the reactor factory with just 2 Marines to defend my base. And then what I want to do is get 6 Hellions and then start getting into the Widow Mines and then get into the upgrades and all that stuff, right? And then what I do when I practice it is I try to get to 140 food at 11 minutes and 30 seconds while doing all the things Flash is doing. So a good example of that is using the Hellions to kill off Zerglings, to position aggressively, get your Widow Mines in between the Zerg second and third, right? That's a huge part of it, at least in the early game, and then from there he kind of pushes out with a lot of Widow Mines and stuff like that, right? But in my own practice, it's very difficult to do. I get almost nowhere near 140 food. Usually my Hellions are late. There's all kind of small problems that I have to fix, and the build absolutely taxes me. My Hellion micro and macro in the background is just not up to par, right? Obviously, I'm trying to emulate one of the best players in the world, so it's very difficult, if not impossible. But at the same time, it's nice to have a build that's very challenging to play. It feels very rewarding when you do pull it off, at least somewhat correctly, right? But when you're looking to find these, you're probably not going to find them with a specific list of you get X at X time, you get Y at Y time, much further along than just the simple, 2 or 3 buildings in a structure of an opening. And that's where you want to start bringing in your own benchmarks. That's when you want to start looking for building groups and building order, right? Like Flash is getting like 9 barracks, but first he gets this engineering base. Then he's just got the 1 factory. Eventually he'll get a second one for more Widow Mine production and to get the drilling class upgrade. So what he ends up doing is his base looks like about 9 barracks, 2 factories, and 1 starport with 2 engineering base, and it's just 3 base, right? It's a really, really solid 3 base. Sometimes he'll take a 4th, but he actually doesn't do it all the time. And that's all you want to try to emulate, and you want to look for his key timings, right? So the key timing, realistically, before any aggression starts happening, is about 11 minutes and 30 seconds. That's when I'm looking to get my 140 food. And that's how I break down the build. And then from there, when I go and play that build on ladder, it's up to me to decide how, when I see a lot of roaches coming at me, how should I deal with that? A good example is like Flash will get a second bunker by his command center on his natural pretty much every single game, so he's kind of prepared for either a bust or a roach play. So when I'm doing that, I feel a lot more safe, right? But then I don't have any games. I haven't seen Flash play against that roach bust. I assume that's why he has that second bunker there, but I never see anybody roach bust him, right? I don't know how he reacts to that. So what I have to do is, go on ladder and get roach busted a few times and see how to react. Just because I die a few times to a certain build or a certain playstyle doesn't necessarily mean the build I'm trying to emulate is bad against it. It just means that I don't quite know how to react to it properly yet, but that will come with time, right? So it's really important you go out and you play a lot of games, you learn as much as you can, you don't go too in-depth into the replay. If you die to like a 7 minute and 45 second Baneling bust, it's because your Hellions were late and you weren't scouting the map. It's not because the build is bad against, really early Hellion play, right? So with that in mind, when you're looking to find standard builds, what you want to do is find a player that you really like. So in my case, I really like Flash. I really like how he plays. So that's why I'm trying to steal my TBZ off him. When it comes to TVP, I might look at somebody else. I might look at I believe Beastie Cutie was doing, a really cool mech style against Protoss. I believe it was him. Or somebody like HTO Mario does that, right? He was playing against Noni with a really cool mech style. So what I might try to do when I go look for my TVP is go find a player that I really like, watch a whole bunch of his VODs, and see if he's doing a different build every game, or if he just kind of has one build that looks very similar with a few different branches out, and then I want to try to steal the build that way. It's very simple. You're not going to find a full write-up on how to play a build properly, how to do a standard build perfectly, because those write-ups don't exist. The good players are the players that can go out there and watch somebody else play, and then go ahead and kind of steal a lot of what they're doing, and then fill in the holes on their own, right? That's how you get a lot of new playstyles and a lot of new meta up. So with that being said, guys, hopefully you've enjoyed this episode. hopefully it's made your brain think a little bit in terms of, standard builds are not that simple, they're not that straightforward. Hopefully you understand a little bit why I'm trying to teach you this time to be a lot more open, and a lot less willing to be like, okay, this is my build. I attack at 11 minutes with +1. After that, I don't know what to do though, right? This time around, I really want to teach you guys how to have really good, solid fundamentals behind you, so that you can go out there and you can find players that you really, really like and you enjoy watching, and you can start using and taking advantage of a lot of the build orders that they use, that fit their playstyle, that'll hopefully fit your own playstyle. Anyway, guys, this is FilterSC. You can find me on twitch.tv at www.twitch.tv/FilterSC. I like to stream a lot of my games. You can also find me on Twitter at FilterStarcraft. And that's pretty much it. Hopefully I will see you guys next time.